Iran just did something highly unusual in Middle Eastern diplomacy. Tehran publicly exposed a trilateral deal between Washington, Paris, and Riyadh, a carefully coordinated arrangement designed to pull Lebanon away from the resistance axis. Before the agreement could be finalized. This wasn't a leak. It was a calculated preemptive strike. Iran burned intelligence sources and revealed ongoing negotiations that hadn't yet produced signed commitments. The question becomes, why would Tehran sacrifice operational secrecy to expose a deal that hadn't succeeded? The answer reveals something more significant than the deal itself. What most analysts missed is that Iran didn't expose this arrangement to stop it. They exposed it because it was already working. And that changes everything. To understand why Iran took this extraordinary step, we need to examine what Washington was actually offering Beirut. And why it represented an existential threat to Tehran's regional strategy. In recent months, American, French, and Saudi diplomats quietly coordinated a comprehensive package for Lebanon. The arrangement included tens of billions in reconstruction financing, political support for government formation, security sector reform assistance, and integration into Arab League economic frameworks. The offer wasn't unconditional. It required Beirut to distance itself from Hezbollah operationally, accept restrictions on weapons transfers from Iran, and realign its foreign policy away from Tehran. The timing was deliberate. Lebanon is experiencing the worst economic crisis in its modern history. Currency disintegration, energy shortages, banking sector collapse, and complete political paralysis. The World Bank has described it as one of the most severe economic contractions globally since the mid-19th century. This wasn't charity. It was strategic leverage applied at maximum vulnerability, when Lebanon's bargaining power had effectively disappeared. But here's what makes this different from previous Western attempts to isolate Hezbollah. This time, the Saudis were leading the effort, not Washington. And that detail reveals the real strategy. This wasn't the first time external powers tried to pull Lebanon from Iran's orbit. To understand why this attempt worried Tehran enough to expose it publicly, we need to examine Lebanon's unique role in the resistance axis, and why previous efforts failed. Since the 1980s, Lebanon has served as Iran's forward strategic position in the Levant. The country provides deterrence against Israel through Hezbollah's missile arsenal, maintains logistics corridors to Syria, and gives Tehran political influence in Arab affairs. Hezbollah evolved from a militia into a state within a state, controlling security in southern Lebanon, providing social services, and representing Lebanon's Shia population politically. Previous Western attempts to isolate Hezbollah all failed. The 2005 Cedar Revolution sought Syrian withdrawal but didn't break Iranian influence. The aftermath of the 2006 war tried to impose international peacekeepers but couldn't disarm Hezbollah. The 2008 Doha Agreement attempted political containment but resulted in Hezbollah gaining veto power. The 2019 protest movement demanded accountability but collapsed without structural change. These efforts failed because they focused on isolation rather than offering positive alternatives, and they faced unified Hezbollah-Iran resistance. The current initiative is fundamentally different. It offers massive reconstruction financing exactly when Lebanon's economy has collapsed. It coordinates Arab normalization at a moment when Gulf states are recalibrating relations with Iran. Most critically, it targets a generation of Lebanese who increasingly blame Hezbollah for economic catastrophe rather than crediting it for resistance credentials. What changed isn't just Lebanon's economic desperation. It quotes that for the first time, an entire generation of Lebanese began questioning whether resistance was worth economic annihilation. And Iran's intelligence indicated the question was gaining traction. This is where the strategic calculation gets interesting. Because Iran's decision to expose the deal reveals something more important than the deal itself. It shows what Tehran fears most isn't military pressure, but economic alternatives. Iran quotes public exposure serves multiple strategic purposes beyond simply blocking the deal. First, it forces Lebanese political actors to choose sides before they can position themselves as neutral brokers, eliminating the ambiguity that allows incremental defection. Second, it demonstrates to other resistance axis members, Syria, Iraqi militias, Yemen's Houthis, that Tehran maintains intelligence penetration of Western diplomatic initiatives, deterring similar temptations elsewhere. Third, it shifts the narrative from economic rescue to foreign interference, reframing the debate domestically within Lebanon. Fourth, it exposes the Gulf states' willingness to coordinate with Washington and Paris, complicating their simultaneous efforts at détente with Iran. Most importantly, the exposure reveals Iran's assessment that the deal had advanced far enough to pose genuine risk. This suggests Western diplomats had secured preliminary commitments from key Lebanese factions. The public revelation wasn't evidence of Iranian strength, but of genuine concern. Washington's strategy represented a sophisticated evolution. Rather than military confrontation or economic sanctions, it offered an exit ramp, reconstruction financing, in exchange for realignment. This approach exploits the fundamental tension in Iran's regional strategy. Maintaining proxy networks becomes exponentially harder when those proxies face economic collapse, and their domestic populations demand material improvement over ideological resistance. The Tritaliana coordination itself reflects careful strategic design. France brings historical ties and cultural influence in Lebanon. Saudi Arabia provides financial resources and Arab legitimacy. The United States offers security guarantees and international institutional support. Together, they address Lebanon's economic, political, and security needs comprehensively. Something Iran cannot match. But that isn't the most important development. The real story is what Iran's response reveals about the changing economics of maintaining proxy networks. And why that threatens the entire resistance axis model. Iran's exposure may have disrupted this particular initiative, but it hasn't solved the underlying problem. Lebanon still faces economic collapse, and Tehran cannot offer the reconstruction financing that Washington, Paris, and Riyadh can. That asymmetry changes everything about the regional balance. This episode demonstrates that regional influence competition has shifted from military to economic domains, a battlefield where Iran holds structural disadvantages. Tehran can provide weapons, training, and ideological solidarity, but it cannot offer reconstruction financing, energy infrastructure investment, or economic integration at the scale required. This matters because post-conflict societies throughout the region, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, desperately need reconstruction capital that only Gulf states and Western institutions can provide. The exposure reveals American strategists have recognized this asymmetry and are weaponizing it systematically. For regional actors watching, the implications are clear. Resistance credentials no longer guarantee strategic value when populations prioritize economic recovery over ideological alignment. Saudi Arabia's central role signals Gulf willingness to deploy financial power as a strategic instrument in competition with Iran, marking an evolution from sectarian confrontation to economic statecraft. Israel benefits from any development that fractures the resistance axis without requiring military action or incurring the political costs of direct intervention. Russia and China observe how economic leverage achieves strategic outcomes that military intervention cannot, a lesson with implications far beyond the Middle East. The precedent matters as much as the immediate case. If economic inducements can peel Lebanon away from Iranian influence, the same template applies to Iraqi militias facing reconstruction demands, Syrian factions navigating post-conflict politics, and Yemeni groups seeking international rehabilitation. What makes this genuinely dangerous for Iran isn't just Lebanon.it quotes, that this template can be replicated everywhere the resistance axis operates, and Tehran knows it. Which raises the critical question: what can Iran actually do now? The exposure bought time, but it didn't solve the fundamental economic disadvantage. So what happens next? Iran faces several strategic options, none ideal. First, accelerate economic integration with China and Russia to provide alternative reconstruction financing. But neither power has demonstrated willingness to deploy capital at the scale Lebanon requires, and both prioritize their own interests over Iranian regional architecture. Beijing focuses on Belt and Road connectivity, not ideological proxy support. Moscow concentrates resources on Ukraine and its own economic challenges. Second, intensify political control through Hezbollah to prevent Lebanese factions from negotiating independently. This risks further domestic backlash and accelerates the generational shift against resistance ideology, precisely the vulnerability the Western initiative exploits. Third, accept partial realignment while maintaining core security arrangements. Preserving weapons transfer corridors and intelligence presence while allowing economic normalization. This limits damage but concedes strategic ground. Western powers will likely recalibrate rather than abandon the approach. Expect smaller, more discrete economic packages to specific Lebanese factions rather than comprehensive national deals, making future initiatives harder for Iran to detect and expose. Saudi Arabia must balance its role in this initiative against ongoing normalization discussions with Iran, creating diplomatic contradictions Riyadh will need to manage carefully. Lebanon's political class faces the fundamental dilemma: accept economic relief with political conditions, or maintain resistance alignment amid continuing collapse. The most likely outcome isn't dramatic realignment, but incremental erosion. Lebanese factions diversifying relationships while avoiding explicit breaks with either axis. The real question isn't whether this specific deal succeeds, IT quote, it's whether Iran can maintain proxy networks when it cannot match the economic alternatives being offered. And the answer is becoming increasingly clear. Which brings us back to the fundamental strategic reality that Iran's exposure revealed, and what it means for the future of the resistance axis. Iran. Quote, decision to expose the trilateral deal wasn't a sign of strength. It was an admission that economic alternatives now pose greater threats than military pressure. The resistance axis was built on ideological solidarity and security cooperation, designed to withstand sanctions, airstrikes, and covert operations. But it's being tested by a different kind of pressure: the promise of reconstruction, normalization, and economic integration. Tehran can disrupt individual initiatives through intelligence penetration and public exposure. It can force premature political choices and complicate Western diplomatic efforts. But it cannot solve the underlying economic equation. Iran lacks the financial resources to offer competing reconstruction packages, the institutional frameworks to provide economic integration, or the diplomatic capital to promise normalization with regional and international actors. The competition for the Middle East has entered a new phase, where Iran's traditional advantages matter less than its structural disadvantages. Military capabilities, ideological networks, and intelligence operations remain relevant, but they're increasingly insufficient when populations facing economic collapse prioritize material recovery over resistance credentials. The question isn't whether resistance ideology can survive military confrontation, IT quotes, whether it can survive prosperity, and that's a test Iran hasn't faced before.